Ethiopia,
Ukraine,
Azerbaijan,
Gaza Strip,
Myanmar.
Sudan's civil war started in April, and it continues.
The number of conflicts and wars in the world are increasing, while the last successful internationally mediated peace process was more than a decade ago. UN-led peace process in Libya, Sudan, and Yemen have all stalled or collapsed. Even the seemingly stable and at peace conflicts like in Israel, Ethiopia, and Myanmar are coming back to life. Now, some of you may think this is just because of social media and the 24/7 news cycle that we are more aware of all the conflicts happening around us. However, that is not it. The number of civil and interstate wars and the fatalities they cause are now the highest they've ever been since 1980s. In today's video, we try and understand why there's been this surge in conflicts recently. So let's get started. Before this recent surge in global conflicts, the world enjoyed a period of relative peace. The number of conflicts and related deaths reached the lowest point between the 1990s and 2010s. These 2 decades marked a significant decline from the post-World War II era, which saw a shift from kingdoms fighting each other to conflicts focused on freedom from colonization. These freedom struggles were typically followed by an internal conflict or a civil war to take control of these new post-colonial states. However, by mid-1980s or so, most of these civil wars that were resolvable were resolved. Another key factor that was contributing to this relative peace was the collapse of the Soviet Union, which ended this ideological rivalry between the West and the Soviets. This meant no more proxy wars being fought in the shadows, leading us to the glory days of the UN with a rise in peacekeeping and preventative diplomacy missions. Unburdened by the major rivalries, the UN could more easily garner the votes needed to push through the resolutions.
I found it to be very straightforward and trustworthy. I was able to get a sense of his soul. I wouldn't have invited him to my ranch if I didn't trust him.
Remember those good old days when America and Russia's romance seemed at its peak? This was also the time when China was opening up to the world trade and embracing capitalism. At least a version that suited their interests. The world for the first time was a unipolar system, and the liberal world order appeared to be functioning at its best. Given the peace we experienced during those 2 decades, the recent spike in conflicts suggests there's a failure in the current polarity and the liberal international order. So let's dive deeper into both of these. What exactly is liberal world order?
Here in the midst of war, the world's people collaborated in the drafting of a workable international constitution, opening with the word, "We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war."
This is a system of rules and institutions born in the aftermath of World War II, and it arose from a deep desire for peace and harmony after one of the history's most devastating conflicts. The core belief was that establishing clear rules which all nations should abide by was the key to achieving goal of global peace and prosperity. Under the liberal world order, governments were expected to protect their citizens while respecting their autonomy and consent. This ideology or the world order was championed by the USA, which led to the establishment of institutions like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and the International Monetary Fund, all aimed at fostering peace and international cooperation. The idea of these institutions were to prevent wars stemming from political instability or economic stressors. But there's always a but, isn't there? As you likely know, the end of the World War II also saw the rise of the Soviet Union with its contrasting ideology of communism. Naturally, the West and the Soviet Union often clashed, leading to a gridlocked UN where only issues with both the major powers agreeing received support, which was again far and few in between. This is the reason why many scholars believe that post-Cold War era is truly when the liberal international order rose to prominence. With the Soviet Union's collapse, we entered 2 decades of what could be considered the most peaceful times. One of the active theories is that this recent increase in conflicts is because of the failure of the world liberal order and its institutions. Now, one of the latest examples of these institutions failing would be the Israel-Palestine conflict, where UN has failed to agree on a ceasefire even though the ongoing war is killing thousands of innocent civilians. The country standing in the way of the peace is USA, the same country that championed liberal world order and the principle of protecting lives. The reasons behind the failure of the liberal world order and its institutions is a direct result of world's changing polarity and the rise in populism. What is the world polarity? You see, in geopolitics, polarity refers to the distribution of power on the global stage. While the Earth has two geographical poles, a geopolitical landscape exists in mainly three states. The first one being multipolar. As the name suggests, the system features multiple countries with strong economies and militaries, and network of partner countries. While some scholars view this as the most unstable system, citing historical examples like the World War I, 7-Year War, and the 9-Year War, it is important to remember that instability isn't inherent to multipolarity itself. In fact, if countries within these systems strive to build ties with each other and share the power, it can create a stable system. Now, the second kind of system is the bipolar system. This system features two main power blocks, both trying to be the dominant force in a geopolitical landscape. In theory, these blocks act as checks and balances on each other, preventing escalation and mutual destruction. A classic example of this would be the Cold War rivalry between the West and the Soviet Union. However, despite avoiding direct war, both sides engaged in numerous proxy conflicts, highlighting the limitations of this bipolar balance. If you get a leader in power with nationalistic views or an autocrat that is just crazy enough, the war is inevitable. Now, an example of a bipolar system where two empires went to war would be the Roman Empire versus the Parthian Empire, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire versus the Ottoman Empire. The history is full of examples where two massive blocs went to war. Just because Cold War didn't turn into a massive war doesn't mean it is a stable system. The stability of a bipolar system arguably relied on mutual ties and agreements. But in reality, it was just the nukes they had. That's the only reason Cold War didn't turn into a massive fight. Now finally, the third kind of system, the unipolar system. With the Soviet Union's collapse, the world entered a unipolar era, with the United States as the sole superpower. Obviously, this system also has its own challenges, primarily lacking accountability. If you're the sole power, no one can really question you. The US invasion of Iraq, based on the false pretense of bioweapons, serves as a great example of this imbalance. Even though this war and the actions taken by the Bush administration contradicted the very rules of the liberal world order that USA had championed once. Furthermore, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan demonstrated the limitations of even the mighty war machine of America when it comes to pushing for a sustaining regime change. Having looked at all the systems, it's very important to recognize that these systems have their own inherent flaws. Regardless of the polarity of the world, achieving peace hinges on cooperation and ties between nations. However, the rise of nationalist leaders with personal agendas can always disrupt this harmony and trigger conflicts. No single system is a foolproof guarantee of stability, which is exactly what we are noticing with the current unipolar world led by USA. Under the liberal world order, the US and the West prioritize spreading democratic ideals across the globe. And also they're prioritizing hyperglobalization by minimizing barriers of trade and investment. And in the years from 1990s to 2010s, it has resulted in significant job losses in the Western countries, fueling economic inequality and resentment amongst the population. Additionally, the focus on international issues within the liberal world order sometimes overshadows the domestic concerns, contributing to social unrest. For example, sending billions of dollars across the globe to multiple countries in the form of aid. Meanwhile, there are homeless people sleeping in the streets of America. This push for globalization has also undermined the unipolar world. If anything, it has pushed the world towards a multipolar direction. You see, with the moving of the jobs to other countries, it allows for those countries to gain more power through the economic gains that they're receiving. As China and Russia's power has risen in the last couple of decades, the unipolar world is under more threat than ever before. So to summarize, there is a growing threat to the liberal world order and its institutions as China and Russia are back at the UN table with their own interests in mind. Meanwhile, there is also this rising threat within the countries to the liberal world order. You see, with the increasing wealth inequality and the loss of jobs, there has been a resurgence of populist leaders. A populist leader's main motive is to make the people believe that they need protection. They need to be protected, and the only person who can protect them is the populist leader. Now, when a populist leader comes into power, a nation tends to pull back and start looking inwards instead of working on global issues. Here's the thing, it's not just these populist leaders in the United States and Europe. The politicians who are not populists have also shifted their stance. You see, instead of finding a way to mitigate conflict in a far-flung region of the world, the attention has instead shifted to dealing with the consequences of the conflict, dealing with the waves of refugees or the cross-border smuggling of drugs and weapons rather than dealing with their cause, the root cause, which is these conflicts happening across the globe. Today, under this current world order, the peace talks are more about containment rather than resolving conflicts, which is especially troublesome when armed actors or regimes remain in control after failed peace processes. Without being held accountable, these groups feel free to repeat the violence, leading to another wave of refugees trying to survive, which further means that people in these countries where these refugees are coming are turning more nationalistic. Here's the thing. The world in the last decade or so has transitioned toward a multipolar system. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the concentration of power is in a few states. Currently, middle powers like India and Japan and others have greater influence compared to what they had during the Cold War era. The world after the 2010s is one where the powers are diffused, making it multipolar but not with absolute powers. You see, just in the last year, Ukraine stepped up its counter-offensive against its much larger neighbor, Russia, which again would be unthinkable a few decades back. A war broke out between Israel and Palestine, and most of the negotiations and peace talks are being conducted by Qatar. Or the diplomatic showdown between India and China over the killing of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil by the Indian government. You see, these things point towards a global shift in polarity. All of these things combined, the failure of the liberal world order, the change in the polarity, and the rise of populism have led us to a point where there is more conflict around us. And in response to these developments and this rising conflict, USA and the West is going through these two contrasting trends. On one end, there's this rise of populism and the idea that these nations should look inwards and stop being out there promoting peace. Or the other end of the spectrum is what Biden's doing, following a Cold War era playbook to go back to a bipolar world where it's USA versus China. But in reality, it's never going to be USA versus China, because countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, there are multiple players with a lot of strengths today that can really shift the power dynamics in this world. The US and the West has to realize that instead of trying to sustain this unipolar world or going back towards a bipolar world, the world has actually shifted towards a multipolar reality. Instead of relying on large coalitions, fostering lateral agreements with multiple players across the globe, which brings the world together, is perhaps a more effective approach to navigate this complex world we are in today. And to summarize, the rise of populism, shifting polarity, and the consequences of failing world liberal order is what is behind the recent increase in the conflicts across the world. That's it for now. I'll see you in 2 weeks' time from now. Peace.